highly affected by COVID. City life has been transformed. And so we think it's a proper moment to talk about the right to the city. And it's a very proper moment also to talk about drugs, to talk about drug policy reform, to talk about harm reduction, to talk about urban planning, to talk about segregation, and all these subjects that we are bringing together in this encounter, in this meeting in which we are gathering organizations and people from all Latin America. And I'm very, very happy to be here today to in this opening talk with Hart and with Raquel Rolnik. And let me just do a quick bio of each of them. So Hart is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Columbia University. He is known, very well known, for his research in drug abuse, drug addiction, and his research seeks to understand the complex interactions between drugs of abuse and the neurobiology and environmental factors that mediate human behavior and psychology. And he is now currently is the chair of the Department of Psychology and the Dirk Sipp Professor of Psychology in Psychiatry. Is that correct? And so we've been following his work for a long time. He's published several books, and we really we're big fans of the possibility of researching, understanding more deeply all the drug abuse situation and all the drug situation. And we also invited today Raquel Rolnik. She is a Brazilian architect and urban planner. She earned her undergrad degree at the University of Sao Paulo. She has a master's degree in architecture and urbanism and a PhD in history from the New York University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She is a full professor of architecture and urbanism, and she is also has been for a long time working in the city of Sao Paulo with urban planning and all that has got to do with cities. And so we
Soncita,
think.
hola, Soncita, perdón, un segundo. Juano.
Is everything okay? People listening to me?
Ahora sí, ahora sí, ahora sí.
Okay, sorry, we're back in track.
No te estaba escuchando.
We're back in track. This new Zoom conference style is not so easy. This new virtual world is not easy for anyone. So I apologize if we're having some technical difficulties, but I think we're back in track. So we wanted to have Raquel and Carl to discuss the intersections of these subjects for what we are very interested in talking about, that is right to the city. So, and finally, but not last, I want to introduce Marcela Tovar. She's a philosopher, and she's been also working with the city hall, the mayor's office in Bogota for a lot of years, and she has a lot of experience in understanding the right to the city. And now she is the second, this encounter is organized by CEPAT, which is an organization she has led for the past years. And so she will be discussing with Raquel and with Carl. They will all be discussing in this opening talk. So welcome you guys, and I give welcome to everyone, and I pass the word to Marcela right now.
Hello. Thank you very much for this gathering. I am Marcela Tovar. I am the director of CEPAT. This will be my last year directing CEPAT. I am very pleased and very honored to be facilitating this discussion between Carl Hart and Raquel Rolnik These are two persons that I admire very, very, very much in different topics. And this is something that we have been looking to do for a long, long time ago, since we're trying with a lot of organization in Latin America and also in the United States. We have been trying to look for the links between how does urban planning and drug use and war on drugs intersect, and how these policies regarding drug use and harm reduction and urban planning and housing, etc., intersect, and also how they damage in a frame of war on drugs, as much as they damage like social policy that are mistaken, or health policies that are mistaken. No, but in the first view, a lot of people have been like asking themselves why they have to do Raquel Rolnik and Carl Hart together in a talk, in a meeting. We're going to talk about several topics. I'm going to ask you some questions and give you some context in order to talk about these topics. This is very transdisciplinary, since we're having a meeting between a philosopher, I am a philosopher, an architect, and a neuropsychologist. So what do a philosopher, it's like a bad joke, no? What do a philosopher, an architect, and a neuropsychology have to talk about, enter into a bar, and what they do have to talk about? They have, I am just what we do as a philosophers, asking questions. So that is what I'm going to do today. Ask you guys, Raquel and Carl, a lot of questions. In the first view, your approaches or their approach are very different topics. Raquel, she talks and she's very well known in a lot of scenarios, not only academic, but also in militant scenarios and politics scenarios about housing, urban planning, population that have been displaced in the cities. And Carl about addiction, harm reduction, racism, stigma, and exclusion. No, but we believe, as Silvia just said, that there is a concept where we all can discuss and meet and talk about different ways to approach drug policy. And this concept is right to the city. Having saying this, we have to take into account that this concept has a lot of approaches and a lot of discussion, and we just given one of them. And I would just to give you a little bit of context about why are we talking about this concept and why are we linking it to harm reduction, because it has been linked mostly to urban planning, but not as much as harm reduction. We had in 2016 a security intervention in Bogota in a place that we have known as El Bronx, or as the people who live there call it, that is the L, like the letter L, in 2016, as I said. But also a very similar place in Sao Paulo called El Fluxo, Cracolandia, had an intervention, a very, very similar intervention, security intervention in 2017. Please, Raquel, correct me if I'm mistaken with the dates. Also in May, both were done in May in different years. After that, some organizations that we work with, people that live in the streets and are people who use drugs, we have been following up what happened with those interventions, and we found out that there has been a lot of violation of human rights, mostly to people who use drugs, but also against people that live in those places. And this kind of intervention, they have this framework of the war on drugs. They have been done in the name of war on drugs. And what they do is that this war on drugs helps to deepen these harms against people who use drugs, but also to society. Mm? So our question now, right now, is what it has to do these different concepts when we put them together. What it has to do addiction, racism, harm reduction, housing, public space, and urban planning all together is like a soup that we're trying to give a little bit of form that is very liquid in this moment. But what are we trying to do is give it a little bit of form. So, as am I a philosopher, and how we deal with this concept and these discussions is what we like to do, first of all, as Aristotle told us, is to give some definitions, to be to be all in the same page on what we understood about some concepts, and to start our discussion with this. So I want to start with Carl Hart and to talk about to us what is harm reduction, and to help you to, because it's like a huge concept and there's a lot of things that we can talk about it, is to give you some key concepts that are interesting for this discussion that we're going to take today. Is the concepts such as addiction, exclusion, but most of all the concepts of brain damage or physical damage produced by drug use, that you, through your research and science, have found out it's overstated. Even though that your book, High Price, and your new book that you are launching very soon, Drug Use for Grown-ups, approach different topics. They underline something that has been subject in your investigations, in your research, and also in your activism, and is how drug use and its harms related to drug use have been linked to the substance that people take, such as, for example, crack, historically. But the facts in your research show that this is more linked to environment, social injustice, stigma, racism, poverty, etc. So having this framework, please welcome Carl Hart to this meeting. It's not a conference, it's a meeting where we all are going to discuss several topics. In this framework, what is harm reduction?
First of all, thank you, Marcela. I'm really happy to be here with you and Raquel, so thank you. That's why I'm really here. I'm really here to hear you all. There are a few things that I'd like to say. I think we should stop saying people who use drugs as if it's some sort of category, because I use drugs. I use all of the drugs that we're talking about, but you're not talking about people like me who are academics, although, you know, I use heroin, I've used all of these drugs. But as you will discover in my new book, Drug Use for Grownups, and there are a number of people who are captains of industry, people who are middle class, higher social class, they use drugs too, but we're not talking about those people. When we say people who use drugs, it allows us to classify these people as someone over here. And it allows us to act as if drugs are the issue in those people's lives. Like in places like Crackolandia, crack is not the issue. We all know this. People need housing. People are unemployed. People need gainful employment so they can take care of their families. There are all kinds of issues, education, issues that have nothing to do with drugs. But as a society, by saying that these are drug users or drugs are involved, it allows for these type of interventions that these governments do, because they say, we're going after the drug dealers. And then many of us, we know that in some communities, people who are in the underground economy, sometimes they may be selling drugs, sometimes they may be doing other gambling, all types of activities that the community may need, including, for example, paying for funerals for people who can't afford funerals. They do, or providing some sort of transportation. They do a number of things, but the things that we focus on is something like drugs, when many of the things that they do are actually good. And so I think we need to change our language, even harm reduction. When we think about harm reduction, we say harm reduction as it's a good thing, as if it's a good thing. And really, it's harm reduction itself is nothing more than prevention or education or being, or just being, having common sense. For example, I brushed my teeth this morning. That's a form of harm reduction. When I get in a car, I put on a seatbelt. That's harm reduction, so I don't get myself injured. Harm reduction when it comes to drugs. Someone may, for example, hand out needles so people have clean needles so they don't get a blood-borne infection. That's harm reduction. But the problem is we only use the term harm reduction as it applies to people who use drugs, as if the only possible outcome from drugs is harm. And that's not the case. People don't do drugs to reduce harm. We do drugs to enhance pleasure, to have a good time. And so we should probably get away from that language and just simply call it prevention, education, common sense, those sorts of things. I want to just also make this point clear too. When we talk about drugs, and then when we talk about me and what I do, people have said that I study addiction. I started out studying addiction, of course, but addiction is kind of boring because number one, um, the vast majority of drug users of any drug, whether it's crack cocaine, whether it's heroin, the vast majority of those people are not addicts. So only a small percentage of drug users become addicts. And so if the vast majority of drug users of any particular drug are not addicts, then you cannot blame the drug for this thing we call addiction. When you look at the criteria for addiction, it has a lot to do with the legality of the substance. For example, say they spend a large amount of time trying to procure the substance. That's a symptom for addiction. That has to do more with the legality of the substance than something related to the substance. So when we look at those criteria for how we judge whether or not a substance is or whether or not someone is addicted, there are these factors that are not specific to the drug. So it oftentimes have nothing to do with the drug. It has to do more with these other factors, these social factors, as I said before. Do people have a home to use drugs in? You know, so they have a safe place to enjoy themselves. Do they have that? Do they have gainful employment so they can take care of their family and they can feel like responsible adults? I mean, it's very important for me to be able to take care of my family. If I couldn't take care of my family, God only knows what I would do or how that would make me feel. I would feel horrible. Are people educated? Lack of education, people may not understand the signs of putting themselves at risk, whether it's using drugs or whether it's doing something else. All of these other factors are far more important than the drugs themselves. So let's try to move away from the language of saying people who use drugs, or if we're going to use that language, let's make sure we include people like me too. I hope that
Thank you
helps.
very much, Carl. You went a little bit ahead of what actually we're trying to reach today. And it's this wider concept on harm reduction, um, not only used in health interventions or to certain type of people, but how do we deal with the concept of harm reduction and in a context of Latin America with certain characteristics that makes drug use in certain population more complex. Thank you very much, Carl. Now, since we're talking also about urban planning, about housing, you already said that, and planning how the city will be organized and the effect in the people that live in, mostly, and how it works, a real estate business, and the population that is more beaten by these types of policies are the most vulnerable, the poorest, that has less opportunities, the ones that are suffering for social injustice and exclusion. So Raquel, we want to talk about the other concept, urban planning. So your book, one of your books, the last one, I believe, The War on Places, in Spanish, La Guerra de los Lugares, you talk about the right of housing and how housing policies have been structured in a neoliberal framework, in capitalism, to be more specific. This means a huge impact on the rights and on this right to have housing and on the people that have been historically excluded, and huge amounts of violence, institutional violence. We're going to have another talk about institutional violence from those policies. But going beyond that, we're going beyond housing and taking into account other elements on urban planning, like public space. Carl Hart didn't talk about public space a little bit, like talking about people that having been able to have a house in order to take drugs if they please that. But talking about public space, urban renovation, etc., how the market and capitalism dictates even the process of soil acquisition that ends in different types of violence that can be exercised to the most vulnerable population, also leveraged by the war on drugs. Can you talk to us about this concept in this framework and taking into account just what Carl Hart just said and the problematics that underlines these kind of policies? Thank you very much, Raquel, for being with us.
Hello. Thank you very much, Marcela. And it's such a pleasure to be here discussing with Carl Hart. Yes, and we're going to see a lot of connections between urban planning and especially now. So let me try to answer your questions, which they are super big questions. First of all, let's understand that, for instance, if we take Latin America and many other places in the world, what has been the main role of urban planning? And I think it's true also for the North American context. Urban planning has been, and for the European context as well, urban planning has a history of a tactic of governmentality, which basically promotes operations of deterritorialization of communities. So we have a history of a model of organizing space under the aim, the objective, the goal of promoting capital accumulation as the main goal, which systematically has produced the displacement, the dispossession, and the banishment of communities from some parts of the city, especially those parts which concentrate the better opportunities in terms of in terms of amenities, of urban amenities. So to say the places where you have rich public spaces, cultural equipment, access to good food and fresh food, access to transportation, access to better conditions. So the idea of expulsing a permanent movement of expulsing those people from these places to the outskirts, to the suburbs, to the other municipalities, to the nowhere land was have marked the history of urban planning in our cities. And of course, in the case of Latin America, that was also marked by a sort of a dual system of producing cities. One which is led by the state and regulations that were set by the state with the industry. Together, the real estate industry in discussion with the state and under the framework of finance and the big finance. And another one, 2 or 3 times greater than this one, bigger than this one, which is the self-production of the city of housing by the people by themselves. In the margins between what we call legal and illegal ways of constructing, which is precisely the urban planning that set the border. Is the urban planning rule that says permanently what kinds of organization of space is legal or illegal, because nothing is legal or illegal per se. It's the urban planning in its language that sets the border. So those self-produced settlements where most of the people live, I would say in Brazilian cities, for instance, the majority of the people live. The majority of non-white people live because it is also has a racial, it's a racialized system and a racialized model where people with less resources, less money live. Those places have a ambiguous situation in relation to the former one, to the so-called legal former one. Ambiguous situation, and this is very important, and I will arrive on that, on this issue of war on drugs. Why? Because if urban planning defines what is absolutely a part of the city and what is ambiguous, what is nobody knows if it's a part of the city or not, if it's legal or not, if it's here to stay or it's provisional. So these parts of the city, they live under a permanent situation of what I call permanent transitoriness. And the permanent transitoriness allows the state machinery to intervene there in a very discretionary way, which means that eventually the state can intervene providing electricity, infrastructure, or school, or can intervene with the repression and the violence apparatus of the police in the name of the war on drugs, or in the name of environmental protection, because eventually those communities are placed in environmental protected areas, because the places that are not environmental protected are not open and are not ready to receive those people as to house the majority of the people. I just want, before I finish that, to add on that another layer. A layer, so I'm talking about a model that is there from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, of last century, which has been aggravated by the hyper capture of the built space as a tradable asset, capable to generate rent interest to an incredible mass of surplus capital, which is circulating in the financial circuit. So why that has aggravated and has aggravated the situation of housing everywhere, everywhere, because housing became a commodity, but also a financial asset. And because of that, those who has less resources, those who need houses just to live and not and not seeking for rent-seeking landscapes, have to compete for the location with the sheikhs, the funds of the Chinese plutocrats or the Russian plutocrats of American millionaires, the pension funds of the workers. So, of course, we are witnessing massive processes of displacement. And because of that, and what is the relation of urban planning with all that? Yes, urban planning has been a very key protagonist, has had a very important role in this process by designing urban projects, public-private partnerships, and other type of urban renewal schemes with a lot of participation of financial capital, which were designed especially to opening new frontiers for this financial capital, which floats over the planet seeking where to park. And guess what? What is the preferred place for this real estate financial complex to come and park? Is exactly in the place where most of the vulnerable people live. Why? Because yes, because of this ambiguity of being legal or not, in part of the city or not, but also because of the balance of power of who lives there. And we're talking about a population which is with very low income and with very low capacity to interfere politically in order to define the agenda. Again, and just to finish, and what is the relationship with that, with what Hart just said? Yes, we can see both in the case of Rio de Janeiro favelas, for instance, where the war on drugs produces a massive genocide of young Black men and women, and also of children, and many situations like that, or like Cracolândia, where supposedly drug users gather. What I can say about Cracolândia is that, and I agree that with Hart, there the use of drugs, and the most principal drug that is used that is alcohol, which is not illegal. Alcohol is alcohol addicts are the most of the people are basically alcohol addicts before anything else. And the scene on the streets, on the public space is there because people don't have house to use that, but also the scene is meant to protect. So is a shield, is a network of people who are basically people coming out of prisons, former prisoners, people that has been institutionalized since their very early age, coming from one institution to the other institution, people that basically never had access to care. never had access to proper care. And instead of providing care for those careless, what is basically done as a public policy is a violent repression because, yes, those people are occupying one of the new frontiers of the real estate financial complex in the city of Sao Paulo. So here we see the connections between the two points of view here. Thank you.
Basically, I have to change my whole schema for asking you. No, I'm just kidding. But this is very interesting. What we are like seeing right now. No, we're seeing the links as Carl Hart told us. We're not talking about people who use drugs. We're talking about certain people who use drugs and people that are using drugs that are in a scenario of high social injustice. Okay. And what it does have, because if we talked about people who use drugs, we would have to talk about the most part of the people that use drugs and doesn't have any problem using drugs. So, and we're talking about what is the impact for these people, but also for other people that are not like frame as drug users, but also suffer from social injustice. And in this frame of urban planning that has a very great impact in the neighborhoods and in the communities. Basically, because urban planning is defining what, as Raquel told us, what part of the city is legal or illegal, what parts live under permanent situation of what you call that, I think that we will have to use this concept, permanent transitories. And places like El Bronx or Cracolandia or El Fluxo are these kinds of places that have been intervened with great amount of repression in the name of drug on wars. You say also environmental protection, but basically in the name of war on drugs. But also it's very convenient in the name of war on drugs because nobody wants to ask about the people that lives in there because of the stigma, because of the exclusion, and because of what we suppose is going on those places. Intervene in the name of war on drugs is avoiding very complicated questions and avoiding to give complex answers to complex context, and wanting to give very simple answers, answering in a very simple way. So we're saying that drug, this scenario, this context has to do with exclusion, stigma, and this has been doing through also urban planning. We stigmatize neighborhoods and we stigmatize people through policies, okay? And that is a consequence on on drugs. Drug use, and this type of these drug users we're talking about, which are not the majority, and the criminalization of these people who use drugs both happen in places. We don't criminalize or not as easy people who use drugs in their houses, but people who use drugs in certain spaces. Those spaces that we categorize as legal or illegal, also as the people and the type of people who are using drugs. Okay, so given this frame, okay, let's analyze different aspects of this type of drug use or this stigmatized drug users and space. First of them, you already talked about them, but let's go a little bit deeper on them. because we have been seeing that there's a lot of problems related that we think they are related to drug use, but as Carl Hart told us, is not a harm related to drug use, but to social services or health services, as Raquel told us. But let's go deeper about housing, okay? Problems regarding housing and this type of drug use. Housing, access to housing, market, and drug use. And my question would be, how do housings affects this type of drug users, the drug users that are most vulnerable, okay, in terms of harms, in their what we call addiction, and how they harm their possibility of well living, and also their possibility on occupying a place. How do war on drugs and market hinders access to housing to historical excluded population? Can you talk about that, Raquel, and then Carl Hart?
Yeah. When I was special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, the UN special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, everybody came to me and asked, first question, what is an adequate housing? How many square meters? What kind of material? What kind of roof a adequate housing must have? So that was the question. So my answer, understanding the framework of the right to housing, which I think it's a very important entry point here, is that adequate housing in general, housing is a portal to many other rights and human rights. It's a very and crucial portal. Depending in the way you are housed, you can or cannot have access to circulation, to transportation, to food, to a good environment, to opportunities, to job opportunities, to income opportunities. So I think that when you see, and I stick on the initial intervention of Carl Hart saying, can you ask me, the problem of the people there is really drug use or is other problems? Is lack of jobs, is lack of income, is lack of care, it's lack of health, it's lack of... So when we see a movement that permanently displaced, permanently dishoused people who are already the ones that are more in need of access to services and good services, of good quality services, in order to survive. So we can see very clearly how much a housing policy is responsible of producing individuals who has much less tools and instruments in order to deal with the difficulties of life, with the pressure and stress of life. And because of that, of course, it's much more easy for all those people to be captured by the drug and the happiness that the drug provides instantly in a life which is a life under denial, permanent denial of access to pleasures of life, simple pleasures like good food, good health, good environment, good life. So I think it's very crucial. And that's why a very significant part of the right to the city is right to adequate housing. And exactly the operations, the war on drugs, what they do is basically displace and throw the people to the homelessness or the precarity of housing more and even more than it was before.
Thank you, Raquel. And in this frame of housing, I would like you, as a neuropsychologist, Carl Hart, to talk about this importance of like having connection, having a place, having this kind of policies and services that take care of people related to this type of drug use that we call addiction and that we call problematic. And you see that I do this problematic drug use, because you have been researching from even from the brain and from the effects of this kind of exclusion, what they do, the exclusion, not the drugs, to people.
So I just like to say, this is not a complex problem. We make it complex. This is very simple. As Raquel has said, when we think about housing, let's just think about COVID-19. If you don't have appropriate housing in this pandemic, you are more likely to die than people who have adequate housing. It's really simple. So if you are a responsible government, you make sure people have adequate housing so they will be able to get educated. That's number one. If you look at a place like Brazil, you look at like average education of people, it's very low. And if you, when you have education levels being that low, you can manipulate the people quite easily. And that's what happens in a lot of these spaces. For example, Raquel brought up Rio, what's happening with the police killing all of those Black people in that place. Many of those people were manipulated into believing that Cracolandia or crack was the big problem. That was a manipulation, and it was, you manipulate the very people who are being negatively impacted, in part because they are not, they don't get the education, they don't see the manipulation, because the manipulation is necessary in order to take over various spaces, as Raquel has noted. And when you start to take over all of these kind of places, and that means that you have greater and greater disparities. Now you need to make sure you have enough police to protect the haves from the have-nots. And so you hire the police. I mean, you hire poor people. A lot of the police are part of the poor people because it's the only kind of job they get. So you have many of these people who are killing their own people because it's the only job they have. So this is not a complex problem. If we make sure people have housing and education and stop focusing on drugs, just get, whenever people start talking about drugs as a problem, you know you are going to be misled. You are being ready to be misled because, as I said, I have been to places like Brazil and Colombia and have done cocaine with some of your high people in your society. That's who are doing the cocaine. But yet we don't talk about drugs with we don't talk about drugs in with those people in mind. And we only talk about drugs when we think about like poor people. Poor people don't need your drug addiction treatment. What poor people need is a way to make money, housing, education, social services. If they have those sorts of things, these problems go away. These are not problems. We create these problems because in large part, part of the problem too has to do with NGOs, because NGOs, they get finances for helping the poor people and with these things like addiction. when they should be advocating for housing and education. That's what they should be advocating for, and not these other things that they're doing. Because if people are able to have gainful employment, education, everything else is taken care of. This is very simple. We are making it more complicated than it is.
Thank you, Carl. This is very interesting what you are both saying, making the links, but also talking about how Carl has been saying how a simple problem it's being approached in a very different way as it would have to be, but also because there's a need or there's an intention on manipulating people. Not, you were talking about the most vulnerable, the people that are like really in those areas, but also I think there's, because they want to manipulate, they also want to manipulate through fear some other people that maybe are not in the middle of these problems, in order to continue with their statu quo. But you have talked about one very important problem related to right to the city. So let's start talking about right to the city, the right of being in a place, the right of transforming in a place, the right of having connections and framework and frames and education and services. And there's one huge problem we're dealing with right now in Latin America, and it's police. You were talking about what just has been happening in this. It's not only in the context of COVID and the pandemic with the police in the favelas and in Rio and in Brazil. It has been happening long before, but right now, since they have a lot of more power and a less of control, they have been worse. And it has been happening in Colombia also, in Bogota. Last 9th of September, we just had 13 people murdered in the streets of Bogota by the police. And we haven't had any outcomes from that, from those investigations in the middle of demonstrations. So talking about police, it's interesting to talk about public space and how they profile people, no? And because most of this stigma about drug use and most of this putting drug use in front of all the rest of the social problems as if it was the big problems, is because part of this drug use is done in the public space. So this construction is constructed, and I'm sorry about using the same word, in those public spaces, because there's not much of a problem in a private party. It's not as controlled by the police or the forces in private parties, but in private space. And there where is the consumption of poor people or homeless or people of color, or that problems arise. So in this context about police and public space, I want to talk about how much public is that space, okay? How public is public space for marginalized people, okay? And about the role of police in controlling those space. How can we talk, since we're talking about these social harms that we are hiding behind drug use, how much harm represents police activity? So, and also what type of restriction in the use and transformation of the space underline police activity? If you want to start, please, Carl.
So Marcela, I didn't tell you that I was in the military for 4 years, and I was a police in the military. So oftentimes the police are some of the least educated people in our society, and I was when I was a police officer. But please understand that police know who they can go after. They are not going after wealthy people, even in the public space, if they are partying in the public space. They are not going after those people. They are going after people who don't have resources. They are going after the politically inconvenient. Police follow orders and they are allowed to do whatever they want to poor people. And we know this. And so, whether there are wealthy people in public spaces or poor people in public spaces, the police will go after the politically inconvenient, because if they go after the people who are connected, then they will be in trouble and they may lose their jobs and so forth. And so it happens in the US, as you all know. So this is, again, not difficult. We allow the police to go after the politically inconvenient. That's why they go after the politically inconvenient. They're, like I said, the police are some of the least educated people in our society, and the jobs that we ask of them are the jobs that we don't want, that nobody else wants to do. And so they behave like you would expect them to behave. They go after the people who who are inconvenient, who we don't value as much in our society. That's what that is. It's not a matter of the public space. It's a matter of who's in the public space.
Can I add something, Marcela?
Yes,
Stepping in.
you were after. Yes, of course.
No, subverting here. No, I think it's important to understand what is the meaning of public space. And again, we taking urban planning and how much urban planning and urban management, I would say more than urban planning and urban management consider public space. First of all, I think that it's very important to say that the metrics, the paradigm of urban planning is private property and private appropriation. And the public space also is seen not as a common space in terms of the possibility of many people to define, to use, to appropriate this space, but mostly as the private property of the government. So public means private property of the government, and private property of the government that should be designed and maintained only to promote and protect the circulation of commodities. So I would say the circulation of the people who are either circulating towards their consumption in order people as vectors and subjects only related to consumption and work. Nothing else is permitted. Nothing else is allowed. And we have a outstanding struggle, I would say, and this is the history of urban and it's the history of the cities, this struggle between the movements of real people to use the street as a common place, and that I will include from street vendors to sex workers, artists, and many, many other uses of public space against this rule and management, which is oriented for one and only goal and objective, which is the circulation of commodities, including the commodity of the workforce that should be from work to home and home to work. So I think that indeed what we have witnessed all over decades, maybe more than 250 years, I would say now, is this ongoing struggle and the police as technology has implemented tremendously the power of the police, but also the lethal power of the police. So we are seeing this struggle becoming more and more violent over time.
Sorry, I forgot to turn on my micro. Okay, this is it's important for us. It's important because we are having these discussions about public space, and not only a place to party on, to have to take any kind of substance or whatever, but a place that, as Raquel pointed out, as a place taken by the people in order to transform it and to use it. That's why, and it's important to talk about street vendors and sex workers and artists, etc., because exactly what we have been discussing is how people are being controlled by police and forces or the state in those public places. But what Carl Hart is telling us, which is very, very interesting, is that it doesn't matter. It is not only that public space is the place where control is taken, but the control of certain population. We can have this public space that Raquel is pointing out, that is not a common space, but the private property of the government. Since we take it as the private property of the government, of course, the forces that are in charge of repressing or taking control of it, we will take control of those populations that are not convenient, as Carl Hart said, for that government, or for the political inconvenience, as Carl Hart said. So we are having this frame about how urban planning has been used in order to control the political inconvenience, because we're not only controlling the public space in general, we're controlling through urban planning the political inconvenience. Saying this, I want to come again, and I know that Carl said it's a very simple problem, and I agree with you, but I want to talk about again about this, what Raquel called this permanent transitoriness. These places that where we want these commodities to the circulation of these commodities, and where we displace people to other places where we know that these commodities do not circulate. We have this researcher in Colombia that is called Ricardo Vargas, and every time we talk about this as activists, and as like we're struggling against war on drugs, we tend to say always that war on drugs has been lost, because there's a lot of resources put in a policy that is not giving any outputs. But as Carl Hart has been saying, and as this researcher Ricardo Vargas says a lot, he said it has been lost, and he always asks for who? Who is losing the war on drugs? Because the wars on drugs have served a lot of people, the cartels to be richer, the financial system to be stronger, the governments to, as Carl has pointed out, to put some social problems, like very deep social problems, behind drug use, or even underground markets, for the real estate to have more profit, etc., etc. So we have these places, and I want, with these security interventions, when we use a lot of these speeches about broken windows in order to talk about these deteriorated places that have served real estate purposes, but also to displace people. And we have what Sarah Evans and Mark Lupansky call that they converge into dominant ways, this intervention in these places. First, for drug enforcement is used as a pretext to cleanse this neighborhood for indesirables, but also drug enforcement is used as a pretext to invade informal neighborhoods. So having this in mind, I want to go deep inside, even though it's a very simple problem. And I would like to talk about to the people that they just pass through these places that are subject to intervention. They don't know about drug use. They don't have these commercials in the TV that show them that the people who take drugs, they're likely to live on the streets, etc., etc., etc. And explain to them, because we have a lot of people that they don't know about drugs and they don't know about these problems behind drug use. What are these places created in these urban areas? Why we have those places, and how can we talk about the people that live in these places and approach a solution without repression and with them? I think that the Foro de la Luz in Sao Paulo, it's a very good example. But it would be important for us to talk, to go deeper inside the creation of these kinds of places. Carl?
Marcela, I like to, for the people who are listening online, one of the things that people, we have these conversations and people want to know what they can do. Can I start there? Can I say something about that?
Of course, please.
So when we think about drugs and the miseducation and the manipulation and the misinformation that people get, one of the things that middle class people can do, particularly those who work at NGOs or just people who are doing well in society, the ones who use drugs. Alcohol certainly is a drug. It's certainly one of the potentially more dangerous drugs. It's certainly when it compares to something like heroin or cocaine, alcohol is right up there. But in any event, middle class people who have privilege, and you're using illegal drugs, one of the things you can do is get the hell out of the closet so people can see that drug users are not exclusively those other people. Drug users are people who look like everybody else in society. So middle class privileged people, you can get out of the closet about your drug use. That's one thing. Number two, when there are those police operations that happens in places like favelas, we know when these things are going on, what middle class white people can do is mobilize and go to those places and put their bodies on the line to ensure that the police do not shoot Black people, and police will behave if middle class white people put their bodies on the line between those communities that have been vilified. That's what NGOs can do. They can help mobilize these people to go and put themselves on the line if they are real allies. Those are two practical things that people can do. And I guarantee you, things will change.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much. It's very important because one of the uses of this intervention, as you were pointed out, is the fear and the whole construction about drug users and this kind of places. So coming out of the closet, here there's an NGO here in Colombia that you know, that is Acción Técnica Social, that they talk about salir del closet psicoactivo, which is coming out of the psychoactive closet, in order for this representation to change for the mainstream of the people that are really afraid of drug use because of all the propaganda. But also that this operation, since you were talking about the control goes over certain type of people, the ones that we are not subject to that control, to go and ensure the police do not shoot, they won't shoot against us, but and to avoid and to prevent the police to shoot to these people. Raquel, it's very, for us, it's very important to know what you think about from the point of view of urban planning, and you have been pointing out this necessity, or this necessity of the governments, of the power to intervene in the name of security these places in order to commodities to circulate, but also we would like to deepen into this type of places, and to the people that have been controlled and violent from urban planning point of view.
Yes, thank you, Marcela. Yeah, I was thinking on your conversation, and also reading some of the observations in the chat. And I think that one of the key issues that are a key problem, a key issue from the practice of urban planning related to these interventions, because yes, if we take what Marcela just said, most of these places, and I can point out favelas in Rio, I can point out the very precarious downtown areas where you have a concentration of homeless people, but also people that pay very, very high rents to very precarious housing conditions, that pay rent for a room, an entire family in one room, or even renting beds per night, which is also very common in the region of Luz, of Campos Elíseos, where it's stigmatized as Cracolândia. So it's very precarious. So it needs an intervention. It requires an intervention in order to ameliorate the condition of the people who are there, in order to ameliorate their housing conditions, in order to transform that area in an area which provides much more opportunities. Yes, but then what is the problem? The problem is the intention, the bad intention of the planners. No, the problem is that the invisibility of the people who live there for those who design the intervention. The invisibility and the absolute lack of deep interaction and conversation with the people who are there in order to understand what are the needs, the dreams, the hopes of the people who are there. So most of the planning practice is made in a central place. It's designed by white middle-class men who does not take into account the reality of the people. And most of the cases, and this is so true in the case of urban planning in São Paulo, in which we from Lab Cidade, we have a permanent observatory of urban policies, and we see, I mean, there are some interventions, including interventions in housing, that displace and don't provide alternatives to those who are displaced. Intervention in housing, for instance, because there is people who are there, they have no voice. And part of the stigma, so this is how powerful is the stigma. The stigma, they are drug dealers or they are drug users, is a way of taking out any possibility for the people to have a voice in the process of designing and defining. And finally, in terms of solutions, I am very proud of being a part of a collective of collectives, a collective of laboratories, of collectives, of NGOs, of people, and from the people who live in the region of Luz, Fórum Mundaréu da Luz, which is an experience in which we try from below to up, from different approaches, people that work with mental health, together with people that work with food security, together with people that work with housing policies, together with people that work with many different fields, and with artists, with people that are there in the territory, deeply rooted there, in order to imagine together a better future from bottom up, and then tackling the real issues that are there. So I think this is an example of, sorry, there is a dog trying to participate here. Quieta. And trying to do that together and trying to bring a response which really connects and really is based with the voices of the voiceless.
Thank you, Raquel. And since I'm going to start to wrap up in order to pass to questions, because I have been in the privilege of asking you questions that I have had for a long time. So I want to share this opportunity with a lot of people that are connected and are part of this meeting that are wanting to ask some questions. So to wrap up, and since Carl started talking about what we can do and what we're able to do in order to make a difference, I would like to start talking and to approach to point out that what Carl started with. I asked him about the meaning of harm reduction, and he invited us to have a wider approach in this sense that it has been understood. No, this meaning of harm reduction transcends the meaning that it has been historically or typically based on medical intervention. So since we're talking about that, the problem is not to take drugs or the substance or the act of taking drugs, but it's wider. So a strategy in harm reduction has to deal with a lot of other things. It has to be wider and go beyond medical intervention, but also go beyond social intervention until the point of talking about urban planning, okay? And this is what we would like, and we were discussing in our group the second meeting that we did in 2018 and we're doing right now in 2020 in the middle of this pandemic. And it has had because of the pandemic a wider discussion about personal liberties, etc. What do we understand but by right to the city? Okay, so what we're talking about is, and as pointed out by Raquel and as pointed out by Hart, is work, this harm reduction has to do a lot with right to the city in the sense that it's a work on a place, on a community, okay? There's a lot of people working about these issues. You've talked about For la Luz Sao Paulo, but we're talking about, I'm just saying a few of them. So please, if I don't mention you, please don't think that I I don't have you in mind, but we're talking about Redes de Mare, we're talking about Paporreto, we're talking about here in Bogota, an organization that is called Sin Judesco that works with young people in Tijuana Casa del Centro. There's also somebody that is not in this meeting that is called Diamantina Arcoiris that works with fashion and sex workers in a very stigmatized neighborhood. But to wrap up and to talk about Right to the City in the context of this wider sense of harm reductions, we're talking about a demand for action and change. Okay, in the middle of processes that are where there's a lot of tension and conflict, but are in the middle of communities, and we're talking about justice and power, and we're talking about new political subjects, or at least we're talking about invisibilized political subjects. I know that you have already talked about we can do, but now I want you to talk as experts or people from the academy, and I just want to do a parenthesis here, and is that we admire you about all the research that you have done, but also because you're very committed academists with activism, and that's very important for us. So as political activists, as academic members of the academia, members of scientific groups, what elements we as activists, as NGOs, as people that are part of these neighborhoods, it's not my case, but there's a lot of people here that are part of these neighborhoods and are in the middle of the resistance, what kind of elements we have to take into account in order to build up these public agendas and in order also to build up these networks. And I think that after this, we can pass to our questions from the public. I don't know who wants to start. If Carl or Raquel.
I think I have mentioned already some of the issues. I think that a, the idea of being absolutely involved, the idea of a research action, the idea of methodologies of research action which are deeply involved with the object of research, which has not this position of being absolutely out and below. I think it's very crucial, and I think that the experiences which are most interesting and promising in this field, they are the experiences that are really into that and promoting what I would say a radicalization of democracy, which is democracy beyond elections and parties, and institutional democracy, real interaction and conversation and building together. I think that this is the way to go on the field.
Thank you, Raquel. I one of the things I admire about Raquel's career is that you're in the academy, but you also have been in the streets, and you've been taking what you learn from the academy, and then you bring it back as a scholar and activist. And I think that's actually rare in the academy, which is unfortunate. So using you, Raquel, as a model, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be active in the academy, in academia, but I understand that the people in academia are the ones who are the beneficiaries of a lot of the oppression that happens. And so they are not really, I don't want to say that they are not motivated to really be out and because they are going to be okay. And so what I ask of people, I ask of any audience, when they're working, for example, this audience, NGOs, they're working in these communities that have been devastated. But the people who are working in those communities, all I ask is that you see the people with whom you work, you see them as human as you. Do you value their humanity in the same way you value your child's humanity, in the same way that you value your own humanity? If we do that, many of these problems are solved. If we don't look at people as some label, some marginalized person, some drug user, instead we look at people as humans and we respect their humanity as we respect our own, then we would be better people. But even the folks who work in NGOs see those people as different. And that's the problem. That's a problem. And so we have to work on ourselves to see others as being human as I am, as being human as you are. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvie is going to take over in order to talk about the questions that have been asked. Sylvie?
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Raquel, so much for this awesome conversation. I would like to start with a comment and question from Maria Elena Ramos. And she says, it's a big challenge for us, Carl, because we've been an NGO for 34 years offering services to poor people, marginalized people who do drugs, but we actually do not know how to do the work to struggle to change the social determinations and the social problems that are surrounding these people. So, any clue on that comment or question, Carl, for Maria Elena?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I have struggled with that question for many years. And I've come to the conclusion that the game is rigged such that the NGOs and the various people are given a task that they are not equipped to deal with, maybe. Or their task, for example, you get funding to do this specific task, and so you work on that task and you don't work on these other things. The main thing that we all should be working on is making sure that people have housing, making sure that people have an education, making sure that people have meaningful employment. We all should be working on that first. If we're not working on that, then you understand how the game is rigged. Because if your funding is not in those areas, you probably are not working on those things. And you have to keep your funding so you can stay gainfully employed. And so it's a trap. It's really disturbing. I mean, when I go to all of these places around the world and I go to these different NGOs and I see what people are working on, oftentimes they're not working on housing, they're not working on education, they're not working on getting these people the skills to be gainfully employed. It's a waste. It's, for me, as I get older, I feel like it's a waste of my time if we're not working on those things, because those are the things that will sustain people. Those are the things that would allow them to take care of their children.
Thank you, Carl. And then we have this other question, I guess more for Raquel, from Mark Krupansky and says, while what we see in cities and what has been discussed already is certainly the result of urban planning and governance models, and as we look to solutions, how much do you see this is the intentional result of these urban plans, or rather expose their failures? Raquel, I think you already read that question on the
Yes, I
chat.
read and I try to address that question because it's a very important question. And I think that the most important thing is not intention, but is to understand how it works and to understand and to do the self-critique of urban planning as part of the machinery of coloniality, of patriarchalism, of white supremacy, of many other things. So we must do this reading, and from this reading, trying to see how much we can reverse that as planners. And then I place myself there as a planner as well, and think how much we can open that. And that's why I mentioned that the main thing here is what type of conversation, who participates in the conversation. And it's so clear that urban planning, the main conversation, including the language of urban planning, is the real estate market, basically. So, and the technical community of architects and of engineers also gravitates around the real estate market. So we are talking basically about the products that those markets want to offer, and the relationship between those products with the overall macroeconomy and production of employment and new and money and rent. And we never really open that. And we open including this discussion because one of the main issues related to that is the difficulties to open for much more participatory, I would say, and that is part of the failure of participatory planning. Participatory planning using the same language, the same products, the same morphology does not work because it was not meant to do this type of job. So I think that it's very interesting because we have to open for a new imagination of designing and desiring cities, and then to open up that for new forms of urban intervention, of course.
Loud and clear, I would say. Thank you very much, Raquel. Um, Ana Clara Tejes says, thanks for this amazing conversation. I would like to ask the speakers to comment further. What's the role of racism and white supremacy? What roles do racism and white supremacy play in the picture they describe, especially in the formation and operation of cities, the relation to global capital, and especially the operation of state violence against the invisible and the unheard? Carl, would you like to start, or Raquel, would you like to start?
Okay, I'll start. Okay. Well, uh, when we think about what role does racism play, I guess we could think about uh, the people who are killed by the police in these various places. In the United States, disproportionate number of Black people. In Brazil, the same thing, disproportionate number of Black people killed, disproportionate number of Black people unemployed, uneducated, in their prisons. And so when we talk about racism, or what role does racism play, I guess the first thing I should have started off by saying is what is a definition of racism, or what definition which I'm working with. The definition that I'm working with is kind of simple. It's where you have these disproportionate negative impacts on a specific group. That's all I mean. And we see it. And so, like, if you have a disproportionate number of Black people being killed by the police, that would be racial discrimination, racism. I use that interchangeably. And it doesn't really matter whether it was intended to happen or not intended. But when it's brought to our attention and we do something about it, then we can't be seen as being racist, because everybody makes mistakes and we didn't know, and we took care of it. But if it's brought to our attention and we don't do anything about it, yeah, then we can say that we are racist in that domain, that specific domain. So that's when I use the term racism and racist, that's what I mean. And certainly racism has played a role in this, in a lot of what we see. But we also know that class plays a role. All of the inconvenient kind of people, they are the ones who are most likely to be negatively impacted. We know this. That's why we try to make sure that we have representation of all of these groups in decision-making positions. And so the role of racism, yes, it's there. It's one of the easier things to see. And yeah, I hope that was clear.
Of course, it's clear. And also it's very important to understand that we are talking about a model, which is a combo. It's a combination of concentration of power and capital. So yes, we are talking about class, but also we are talking about patriarchalism. We are talking about men deciding over everybody how should a city look like. We are talking also about white people deciding over the society, and the racist and patriarchal nature of the system that I am referring to, which is the capitalist system. They are part of the same system. They are not something that is added to an identity beside the structural characteristics. I think that, and thinking on urban planning is absolutely essential for governmentality, essential for defining and occupying space in a way that benefits some and not others. The racial nature of it is a very important part of it. So that's why the anti-racist struggle is so important now, because it does not relate only to Black people. It relates to the whole combo, and what it's implied on that is of permanent processes of displacement, dispossession, and banishment. So I think it's very important, and thank you for your question, because I think this is a very central question, and I would say racist in terms of non-white, because that means in many, many occasions also indigenous populations. And I think it's very important to state that in Latin America, for instance.
Thank you, Carl and Raquel. So for last question, just before wrapping up and saying goodbye to you, something that we don't want to do, we would like to stay here talking with you forever, non-stopping. But we know we are aware that you have a life. So Patricia from La Casa del Centro, who's been very active in commenting and talking and expressing views, she sends this final question. How do you choose to work with that many competing priorities? Educational directed to communities, education directed to communities. I mean, I think that question has got more to do with the position of working for housing, for education, for opportunities, né? And so she asks, how do you choose to work with that many competing priorities, and which of them? Education? Raquel? Hart?
That's a good question. But I think the answer to the question is determined by your skill set and what you have access to. Somebody might be better at helping with the education component than they are with the housing component. So it depends on people's skill set. But just to be clear, just so long as we understand that those most important things are housing, gainful employment, education, those sorts of things. Once we understand that, whatever your skill set, it would be hugely helpful, and it will go a long way.
Raquel, would you like to add something?
Yeah, one of the traps of urban management is the sectorial approach to the question. So what I have learned also working with my colleagues and friends at the Fórum Mundaréu da Luz in Campos Elíseos, Brazil, is that it's just impossible to approach such a delicate and complex area from one single sector: housing, health, education, food. So one of the lessons that I have learned is how much those things are interconnected. And I would dare to say that these sectorial approaches, they also have to do with the business that gravitates in the different sectors. So the construction sector and the financial sector, which dominates housing, and then the network of private education that is been dominating education, and then medicine and pharmaceutics, and the network of hospitalization that dominates the sector of health. And when we see the intervention needs to connect those parts and to connect those sectors and to work in a more holistic way. I know how difficult it is what I'm saying, but I think that part of the utopia, because we need utopias, please. We need utopias in order to lead our action and in order to give us hope in the future. So I think in one of them should be the interconnection of all that and have much more integral interventions rather than sectorial ones. And having them from bottom up, which means let us together design interventions, and then please public money come to fund the interventions that we have planned together, instead of distributing the public money to the sectors, so each sector can design spaceships to arrive in the territory that have nothing to do with the territory and implement things that have very perverse side effects. Let's reverse this idea in terms of urban management. I think this is the future, not only for this specific question, but for all of them related to territories.
Thank you very much, Raquel. I would like to pass the word now to Marcela, who wants to say a little conclusion or wrap up, and then I'll just come back to say goodbye to all of you guys and to pass to the second part of this meeting, which is getting to know all the people who is being part of this second Latin American gathering on Ride to the City. So Marcela, please.
Well, just to wrap up, and first of all, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure for all of us, and I know I can speak not only for the ones who are like here connected to Zoom, but also for the people that are in the social media, in the streaming of this opening of our meeting. Um, I have been thinking about in this work about right to the city and what has been said, what Raquel has been said about is not only racism and black and color people, but also the patriarchy that goes around all these policies and all these combos. And that makes me think of this woman philosopher, and she's called Miranda Freaker, and she talks about epistemic injustice. And there's two types of injustice in the epistemic injustice, that are the testimonial injustice and the hermeneutic injustice. That sounds very complicated, but as Carl said, this problematic is very simple. And what we were talking about, and we feel that this is very complicated in order people to realize that it's a very simple problem, is that these populations are subject to what Fricker called the testimonial injustice, which means that they are not only not recognized as political subjects, but even as epistemic subjects, which means people that are able to produce knowledge, people that are able to produce proposals. The only ones that are recognized as epistemic individuals are this white man in his office designing urban planning. So that's why between color people and a white man talking to a police, the white man is going to be more reliable to the police, because the other person is subject to this testimonial injustice. And what we're trying to do in this meeting, in order for you to this other type of which means that some type of, we don't have the tools to give it sense and to explain ourselves what's going on and what is it about this injustice. So when we get together, and that's why these spaces, this scenario of getting together and talking are so important, is that while talking together and talking about our own experiences and how we live this injustice or these things are going on, is that we make sense. And as we make sense, we're able to build our agendas. That's what I wanted to say to wrap up, that I think that it's what we have talked about in this discussion, because it was not a conference. Thank you.
As I mentioned, we could stay here forever. It's such an honor and such a pleasure to be discussing with Raquel, with Carl, with Marcela, and I would love to, open up the mics now for everyone, but I know Carl and Raquel have a very busy life. Just for everyone to know, Carl Hart is launching his upcoming book a few days from now. So keep your eyes open, and hopefully we can all get a copy because we are dying to read it. We are definitely dying to read it. And if some of you haven't checked Raquel's blog and her monthly YouTube video, please do, because it's awesome. It's great. It's funny. It's interesting, and it's such a enlightening moment. Thank you, Raquel, very much for being here with us tonight and for being part of the inspiration and being part of that utopia that you were talking about, because you are definitely big inspiration. And thank you, Carl, very much for being here too. You're also big inspiration. I From now on, I'm gonna talk about drug users, always including myself. It's I haven't done that before, not because I am ashamed, but I never thought it the way you mentioned. So that was very enlightening to it. So thank you very much, both of you, and hopefully we can meet again in another space like this, or hopefully I'm better when the pandemic is over, we can all get together and have a drink.
I hope we don't have to ever meet like this again. I hope the world doesn't have to see this ever
Yes,
again.
yes.
I hope we
Our
are
Let's hope in
with each
person
other.
having a drink together.
Yes, or some better drug than alcohol. I know something about that. I'm happy to help with that.
That would be great. Thank you
It-
very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.